there now with me in studio, Brid Smith Solidarity People Before Profit TD for Dublin South. The Minister makes the point, look, we need, as of now, in a transition phase, continued access to fossil fuels. If we get it close to our shores, it would be really stupid not to make use of it.
Well, I think this illustrates how the difference between what we say and what we actually do, because the science 10, 20 years ago rested on the understanding that we have to leave 80% of known fossil fuels, never mind the ones we don't know about, in the ground if we are to succeed in preventing the globe from overheating. And if we accept the science, and I assume the Minister does, then we have to accept that logic, which means that issuing exploration licences now in Ireland flies in the face of the idea that we have declared a climate emergency.
So we just let it flow in from Russia like we have done up to now?
Well, you see, what the Minister didn't tell you is that we have about 15 to 18 years left of Corrib, and Corrib gas is still coming on stream. What is also not illustrated by what the Minister said is that the regime, the licensing regime that we have here in Ireland, doesn't automatically mean that those who explore and find and extract gas or petroleum are obliged to sell it back to the Irish state. And if they do, they sell it at market value. And if they do, we get no royalties for it. They get a very low tax regime, so we get very little return from it. So it doesn't make sense that if we are to stop the planet overheating, and the IPCC has said you've got 12 years to get your act together, that after 15 years of Corrib, we'd be still allowing the exploration licences that were issued last year are good until 2033. If they find anything by 2033, if we're supposed to be 70% reliant on renewables and then heading for zero to 2050, it does not make sense to issue any more licences, leases or undertakings.
Meanwhile, you're opposed to the idea of increasing the carbon tax, are you, from €20 per tonne to 80 by 2030?
I am. I'm for a carbon tax. We are for a carbon tax. Doesn't personalise this at all, but we are for a carbon tax. But we're for a carbon tax on the profits of the gas and the oil industry. They make vast profits. They bring the gas and the oil into this country, or they extract it from Corrib, and they pay very little taxes on it. What a carbon tax doesn't do on the consumption of ordinary people is address the needs of ordinary people. The Minister was quite eloquent there and eloquent in describing how our older properties, the homes that we live in that are older, need to be retrofitted. They're not properly insulated. They don't have the same energy level bear rates as the new properties that are very well built and very well insulated and have renewables coming into them. How is one supposed to insulate one's home on an average industrial wage, or even in what they call fuel poverty? Fuel poverty, by definition, here in this country, is if you are on fuel allowance.
Maybe it's a question of rebalancing. In other words, if people who are in vulnerable situations, typically, heating their homes with coal or briquettes or whatever, that they can be helped through either returning by way of increased fuel allowances or whatever, or helping them to insulate their homes.
Well,
the extra cost that would be imposed on those fuels.
That's the model, and that's the model that the committee were looking at in terms of a dividend and return, and it's mainly the British Columbia model that they looked at. What they refused to do was to accept a piece of research that I submitted and asked them for us to scrutinise, which comes from a global NGO called Food and Water International, and they have done a very good piece of research onto how the model for carbon tax on ordinary people's consumption actually works. And they have shown that it doesn't, in fact, help to reduce emissions, that the biggest reduction in emissions that we saw in countries, particularly British Columbia, where it was introduced, happened during the recession, when production dropped, production by companies. And I listened to the Minister very carefully, and he mentioned homes, he mentioned communities, he mentioned schools, he mentioned public buildings. He didn't talk about industry. And there is a massive fossil fuel industry out there, and industries related to it, like aviation, like the plastics industry, which don't pay their fair share in terms of the damage that they do to the planet. And I think that that's where we should be looking.
By the way,
for
the department has been on to say there's less than or fewer than 10 years left in Corrib, not 18 as you're saying.
Well, that's a different thing than what they said at the committee. At the committee stages, we were told that there was something between 15 and 18 years left in Corrib. So now they're reducing it again, but the committee only happened less than 6 months ago, not 5 years ago. So, but nevertheless, the point remains that gas as a transition fuel, for us to say that we keep issuing exploration licences because we don't want to look to Russia or anywhere else, those that are issuing who are getting the exploration licences, like Petro Resources, are looking to do deals with Gazprom, the Russian gas company, for exploration off our shores in the Barrymore and the Porcupine Basin. So Russia and China and all of these global corporations, ExxonMobil, the whole lot of them, are involved in receiving licences from the Irish state. And our argument is we have to listen to the science. This is an emergency. If we have the words there, let's have the deeds. Keep it in the ground and stop issuing the licences.
But your point is, though, that it's sort of big business or big oil should pay extra, not the people who are using it.
On their profits. And the people who are using it
But is that just not populist kind of rhetoric, as opposed to it's something that will make people change the way they do things?
Well, I'm trying to tell you, Sean, that the research shows that it doesn't change behaviour. What changes behaviour is the provision of systems that will allow people to change behaviour. So, for example, they've just introduced free public transport in Luxembourg to get people out of their cars. We propose something similar as an aspiration for the Irish state in the future. It was completely rejected. They wouldn't even discuss it at the committee. And there are many measures that we could take, like the immediate establishment of a state company to retrofit every home in the country, give kids apprenticeships on how to do it, lag attics, retrofit the homes, deep retrofit them, give them the heat pumps. If that was rolled out as a project, it would create jobs where people would then be paying taxes. It would generate its own finances, and it would mean that we're burning less gas, less coal, less electricity.
Should we stop all peat extraction?
Yes, we should. And I think that that's in the process now. The problem, however, is, and I was at a conference in Tullamore 10 days ago, that the way that the Bord-na-Mona workers and the communities that depend on Bord-na-Mona in the Midlands, etc., are being treated by the company is really abysmal. And that is the words of the trade union officials. They're being offered a voluntary redundancy package to only certain sectors. So let's say me and you are working in Bord-na-Mona, we both apply to be made redundant. We will be selected on the basis of the use that we have to the company. We will only get statutory redundancy, and we will be selected on the basis of our age and the number of years left in it. The unions are saying they're being treated abysmally. This is the first challenge of just transition. That's the term that's used to say, how do we get communities and workers away from fossil fuel dependency to renewables? And we are making a bags of this big time. If we don't bring the Bord-na-Mona workers and their communities with us, then this is a very bad example for the future.
Brid Smith, thank you for joining us. Solidarity, People Before Profit TD for Dublin South Central. We'll be talking to a man whose business is under threat from rock